This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. The U.S. and Russia are sparring over human rights. Congress passed and President Barack Obama signed a new law that bars Russians guilty of human rights abuses from traveling to the United States. The measure was named the Magnitsky Act, after the lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, who died in a Russian jail. Russia's foreign ministry denounced the law as dangerous and called it interference into our internal affairs. Russian President Vladimir Putin called the passage of the law an unfriendly act. What will the Magnitsky Act do for human rights? And what will it do to U.S.-Russian relations? I'll ask my guests. Carroll Colley, who studies Russia for the Eurasia Group, and David Satter, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Carroll Colley, this Magnitsky Act was part of a larger bill involving trade with Russia. Where does this fit in the broader picture?
Exactly. This was really set into force by Russia's entry into the WTO back in August.
The World Trade Organization.
The World Trade Organization, exactly. The United States could not recognize Russia as a member of the World Trade Organization because of this rather outdated law that we still had on the books, known as the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And this dates back to the Soviet period when Russia did not allow free immigration. And in other words, we could not grant Russia what's known as permanent normal trade relations because the president had to issue a waiver every year that Russia was in compliance with the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. So because the Congress had to take up this trade bill, it created a really good opportunity, I think, for certain individuals and lobbyists to get behind the Magnitsky Act and for congressmen as well. So that's where the genesis of the Magnitsky Act really begins.
Well, David Satter, why this focus on, of all the things that have been going on between the U.S. and Russia, on the plight of Sergei Magnitsky? Where does this fit in how Congress is looking at relations with Russia?
I think the Magnitsky case was especially poignant for many people because he was investigating corruption at the highest levels of government. He was investigating, in fact, a tax fraud perpetrated against the Russian government itself, but carried out by insiders. And as a consequence of that, he was tortured and killed. And the Russian government and Russian officials showed no inclination to investigate or punish those who were responsible. Under those circumstances, he very easily became a symbol of, on the one hand, Russian corruption, and on the other hand, Russian lawlessness. And all of this came against the background of a situation in which corrupt Russian officials are stashing their money in the West, are basically relocating a large part of their lives to the United States and other Western countries in order to facilitate the kind of pillaging that's going on in Russia itself. Well, it was only a matter of time before something like the Magnitsky Act was considered in the West, because the corrupt officials in Russia had created of themselves too big a target. And finally, the inevitable happened. And the West began to resist facilitating their corrupt activities.
Well, what does the law actually require? So we have this opening up of trade policy to Russia, and then we have these restrictions. Carroll Colley, what are the restrictions related to the Magnitsky Act? What do they actually require?
Well, the three specific areas. First of all, Russians who participated in any way with the Magnitsky affair and any other Russians who might be involved in human rights abuses will be banned from receiving a U.S. visa. Any assets which they have in the United States will be frozen. But more importantly here is that their names will be published in the Federal Register. And this is really what the Magnitsky Act is about, is naming and shaming. In actuality, President Obama implemented a Magnitsky ban last year. He was actually opposed to the act, and so he tried to subvert that by imposing a visa ban on certain individuals. We don't know their names because that violates state protocol, but prohibiting them from receiving visas. So that's what the law essentially does. But of course, symbolism is very, very important by listing their names in the Federal Register.
David Satter, who makes that decision, and how are they supposed to know who's guilty of what in these murky cases in Russia?
Well, this is a very important question, and this is also an issue that opponents of the act have raised in this country. We're going to have to rely on the probity of our embassy and of our government in determining who was involved and who is guilty. But a great deal of work on that has been done by Bill Browder, the head of Hermitage Capital, who was the employer of Sergei Magnitsky. And in the case of many of those who have been accused and who are undoubtedly going to appear on that list and whose names are going to be publicized, there isn't a great deal of doubt. As for the possibility of there being people on the fringes of the case being wrongly named, I presume that there'll be judicial recourse.
Now, Carroll, Colley, the response from the Russian Foreign Ministry and from other officials in Russia, outraged over this act. Sergei Lavrov accused the U.S. of legalizing torture and kidnapping of people all over the world, and thus having no position to be calling out on human rights for anyone. And Sergei Lavrov said that U.S. lawmakers see our country not as a partner, but as an enemy. How significant is the conflict over this between the Russian government and the U.S. government?
I believe the conflict is significant. Of course, the Russians were outraged at this. They do view it as an intrusion into the domestic affair. And Lavrov consistently points out a number of cases where the United States, in his view and Russia's view, may be violating human rights. And they mention quite frequently Guantanamo Bay and drones in any number of instances. And they actually published a report this summer that highlighted the problems with the United States human rights regime. So I think that they view it as they're incensed by this. And I think that it will have, at least temporarily, at least for the near term, it will have a negative effect on U.S. relations. And we've already seen the Russian response. Congress passed the bill on December the 6th. On December the 7th, the Russians announced a ban on ractropamine. Now, this is a food additive that we add to beef and pork. And the United States is one of the largest exporters to Russia. By announcing this ban on ractropamine, essentially Russia was closing its markets to not only to U.S. beef and pork, but to beef and pork from other countries that are using this. But the timing was really critical here. They were sending a very strong signal to the United States Congress of their disapproval. And I wouldn't be surprised that going down the road, if they implement other ad hoc measures along the way, specifically targeting U.S. companies that may be working in the Russian market.
And David Satter, where does this fit in what else has been going on in Russia, which is a growing number of restrictions on non-governmental organizations, civil society groups that have been supported by the U.S. in the past, and laws in Russia that have banned that?
Well, there's a general tendency toward a worsening of relations. I don't think that the ban on or the requirement that NGOs that receive foreign support register as foreign agents is directly connected to the controversy over the Magnitsky Act. I think what we're seeing with the Magnitsky Act is the corporate sense of a corrupt ruling group that is trying to defend its interests. And I mean, logically, they should be pleased by the Magnitsky Act, which makes it that much more difficult for wrongdoers to evade justice in Russia, because after all, the crime was committed in Russia. But insofar as this group is lawless and doesn't tolerate any limitation on its ability to engage in corrupt and illegal activities, they correctly identify the Magnitsky Act as a threat to them.
Well, Carroll, Colley, President Vladimir Putin said that the U.S. talks of a reset, but now they make the situation worse. What are U.S.-Russia relations going to be like for the rest of the Barack Obama administration?
It's a tough question to answer, but I think if you look at when Putin announced back in September of last year that he was going to switch places with then President Medvedev, and that he was going to return to the presidency, the fallout from the Duma elections that happened in December, which were very obviously corrupt, that you've seen a worsening of relations between Russia and the United States. And this is not to say that we're falling off the cliff, but nevertheless, relations have certainly become more strained. And I think that the good vibrations between President Medvedev, or former President Medvedev, and President Obama, that was the real rationale, and I think that was the driver behind the reset. Since we have a different relationship now, I think you'll definitely see changes. I think it certainly will be more strained. A lot of the low-hanging fruit that Obama was able to harvest when President Medvedev was in power during the reset, that's all been taken care of. So going forward, I think there are obviously less areas for cooperation. I think it certainly will be more difficult, but nevertheless, there are areas, strategic areas, where we do cooperate. Afghanistan could be one. We've seen Russia move off their hard position towards Syria. So I think globally, strategically, there are areas where we cooperate, but definitely it'll be in a period of much more strained relationship.
Well, Carroll Colley of the Eurasia Group and David Satter of the Hudson Institute, thanks so much for joining us.